Hello and welcome to another video of the Simplified opening series. This video can be considered like a second part or a complementary part to my video on the Alapin Sicilian from the white side that I published a few weeks ago. So in this video I would like to demonstrate two games by one of the most famous players to ever play the Alapin Sicilian, formerly Russian, currently Dutch Grandmaster Sergey Tiviakov. Now, I have to say that I have always been impressed by his treatment of the Alapin Sicilian and the positions that I discussed in the previous video on the Alapin, which are these positions with white having a queenside majority of 3 pawns versus black's 2 pawns on the queen side. And he has played these positions with both colors with great success. And in the games I'm going to demonstrate, you will see that it's kind of really shocking, I would even say, how he manages to win seemingly without an effort. And this is what drew me to these positions in the first place. Before starting, I would also like to note that I first kind of got more acquainted with these games when studying Tiviakov's book, Rock Solid Chess. So if you are interested in these types of positions, and there are more examples in that book, I would recommend you take a look at it. This is like, I'm not affiliated or anything with the book or Sergey in this manner. I'm just recommending it because I really think it's a good study material. So let's get going. So e4, c5. And now, like I said, I'll demonstrate two games. In the first one, Tiviakov played the direct move entering the Alapin with c3, and in the other one he went knight f3 and then after e6, c3. But we will start with this one with c3 on move 2. So knight f6, e5, knight e5, and bishop c4. In the video, if you may recall, I recommended the move knight f3, but I will immediately say that the move orders are not of utmost importance in these in getting these positions. The important thing being getting actually the positions. So here we see Tiviakov using a move order by delaying the knight from g1. And if you're really interested in the Alapin, you can take a look at these various move orders which you can use to confuse a little bit your opponents. Tiviakov has been making a living out of that for decades, so you might as well check it out yourselves. So knight is attacked, knight drops back to b6, attacking the bishop, bishop drops back to b3, knight c6, attacking the knight on e5, knight f3 defending it. This is actually one of the more popular tabias in the Alapin when black's main choice is the move c4 or d5. So there are two main choices, and here black plays d5. The black player in this game is the Ukrainian Grandmaster Stanislav Savchenko, who I actually got to know 2 years after this game was played, and at that time he was already over 2600. And I happened to share a room with him at the very famous Benasque Open tournament in Spain. And he was actually kind of important for me as a kind of providing a good atmosphere, you know, and some advice, because at that tournament I actually made my final Grandmaster norm. And okay, he was very supportive for me in that tournament, so I'm really grateful to him for that. But in this game, okay, he chose a kind of a theoretical line against the Alapin, obtained an equal position, and then we will see what happened. So he takes d6, queen takes d6, knight a3. Now Tiviakov plays the move I recommend in various versions in my video. One of the ideas is to get the knight to b5, attack the queen, and also support the d4 square. So bishop e6, one of the options, d4 now. Bishop takes b3, queen takes b3, c takes d4, knight b5. Here comes the idea, a double attack on the queen and the pawn on d4, which ensures that white regains the pawn. Queen d7, knight b takes d4, knight d4, knight d4, and e6. So it's move 13, and we have this pretty simplified position on the board. And you would say, how on earth is possible to win this position? I mean, black has exchanged pieces, has no weaknesses, will soon castle. Like, how do you win? And this is the I would even say magic of these positions, and especially perhaps Tiviakov's play in them, is that he always kind of had this good feeling about how to play these positions, but also he kind of collected along the way some guidelines and rules of thumb how to play these positions. So for example, about this position, he says that even though the engine might say that it's an equal position, from a human perspective, white actually has an advantage. And the reason for this, his opinion, is that black lacks activity. So if you look at black's majority, if black is to advance it, he should play the move e5. But in that case, when e5 is played, the d5 square is weakened. So then white will aim for an exchange of a bishop for a knight, and then planting a knight to the d5 square supported by the c4 pawn. So you see, it's not that straightforward for black to kind of advance his own majority, as it leaves weaknesses behind. But this cannot be said for white. White can simply go a4, a5, kick away that knight, put pressure on the b7 pawn, and maybe even go all the way to a6 to create more weaknesses in case of an exchange. Then the a7 pawn would be weakened in case of b6. Yeah, so let's say the pawn goes there. In case of b6, then the knight from b5 would target the pawn on a7. So there are ideas already here for white. Or final idea, yeah, the pawn gets to a5 and black plays a6, then the b6 square would be a rather weak one, and then the b7 pawn would be a backward pawn. So again, the point here is the practical aspect. The engine would just simply laugh, okay, and then it would make a draw without any problems. But for humans, this is not so simple and straightforward. And just simply see what happens in the game. Short castle, bishop e7, rook d1, and the rook is active on the d file, castles, and now Tiviakov had a choice. He went for bishop f4. A simple developing move, even though it was possible to go knight f5, attacking the queen and the bishop, and after the queen moves, take the bishop, knight e7, queen e7, bishop e3, and let's say knight d5, bishop d4, and play this position bishop versus knight, which again is slightly more pleasant for white. The bishop's looking down both sides of the board and can still support the advance of the queenside majority, whereas black having this knight on d5, which first and foremost is not stable because it can be attacked by c4, and second, if black is to advance with the pawns with e5, then the knight will lack the pawn support. So again, it's a bit more difficult to play with black. But Tiviakov went knight bishop f4, now queen a4. So black plays for exchanges with the idea that, okay, things should be safe here. Yeah. But as we shall see, and this is a recurring theme in Tiviakov's games, exchanges favor white in these positions. So another demonstration of that is the following game. Yeah, bishop e3, and now black a little bit perhaps too straightforwardly took on b3. Just some neutral move like rook fd8 was better, because what happened in the game, just keeping is like it is on the queen side. Yeah. So the queen on a4, the knight on b6 effectively prevent white from advancing the majority. And taking on a4 is not what white wants to do because the knight is kind of unpleasant on a4. So that would have been better. Yeah. But in case of queen b3, a b3, now this is already an improvement of white's position. There is no more idea of a4, a5 or so, but the a file is opened, and the double b pawn can be used for, let's say, b4, knight b3, knight a5, or knight c5. So again, the majority is still mobile and can be further advanced. So in a way, this exchange of queens is a concession by black. He was not forced to do so. And this is how these games for the black side are lost, little by little. Okay, never a major blunder, but concession after concession. And at some point, black is forced to make an only move to stay in the game. Normally, black fails, and then the game is lost. So knight d5, knight f5 now. So targeting the bishop on e7. Knight e3, knight e7 check would win a piece, obviously. So bishop f6, knight d6, b6. The pawn was attacked on b7, yeah, and b4. So white is, as you can see, very consistently following the plan of advance on the queen side. Now, for example, taking on e3, fe3 is not a problem for white at all, because the d file is open, and this pawn on e3 is easily defended. Let's say bishop g5, king f2, and it's not really a weakness as it cannot be properly taken advantage of. So black goes to rook fd8. Now knight b5, the knight escapes, attacks the pawn on a7, a6, and now knight drops back to d4. So up to here, except for the exchange of queens, both sides played in a normal way, but you could feel, yeah, that white is pushing his own agenda of attacking, of advancing on the queen side, whereas black is playing normal, neutral moves, but not actually doing much on the king side and in the center, but just playing with the pieces, centralizing, sensible stuff. But it's clear that white is the one who has the initiative. The engine would still say this is equal, and I think it was somewhere at 0-0-0, something like that. And the moves that the engine is suggesting is something like, let's say, h5 or g5. Yeah? Basically starting the advance and not touching anything in the center or on the queen side. But for a human to play like this is like pretty strange and hard. Because you see, this one, the pawn on a6 is under attack. If the knight moves, the pawn on b6 will be an attack. Both pawns feel a bit loose. And black must always be on the lookout for some advances with b5 or c4. So it's a bit unpleasant. And just to ignore all that and start playing moves, vague moves like g5 or h5, saying that this is 0-0-0 is just engine territory. And, well, things don't work like this in practice. It's worth pointing out that, for example, exchanging bishop for knight, bishop d4 favors white, yeah, because the bishop is quite good on d4, targeting this pawn on b6, let's say f6, and now Tiviakov suggests something like f3 with the idea to get the bishop back to f2 and open the d file, and while the engine suggests the more direct c4, kicking the knight out of d5, and after knight b4, bishop b6, immediately obtaining a passed pawn, while this pawn on a6 still remains a weakness. So this is already a notable progress for white. Another not so great idea is the move b5, yeah, because it just weakens these squares, especially c5. So knight b3, and then either a knight can come to c5 when the pawn on a6 is weakened, or the bishop can come to c5, and then the knight can come back maybe to d4. White can then slightly, probably at some point, organize b3, c4, kicking this knight away from d5 and advancing the majority. So again, this is not something a human would consider. What black did here was a massive exchange of both light pieces, and this turned out to be again problematic. So after knight takes e3, f takes e3, I think black made the somewhat rash decision to exchange knight for bishop, bishop for knight, because this kind of even further strengthened white's structure after further e takes d4. The engine still claims that this is equal without any problems with moves like a5, which again is a bit strange to a human. Now, white can consider both b5 and knight c6, or ba5, isolating this pawn on a5, or again, something like pretty vague h5, just ignoring anything and starting advancing the pawns. Again, this only shows you how hard it is to play these positions from the black side and how easy and pleasant it is to play from the white side. But after bishop d4, rook d4, now already white is winning the d file after rook a d1, rook d4, e d4. It's clear that white's 4 pawns here in the center on the queen side are rolling forward. Additionally, black still needs to defend this pawn on a6. White's plan is simple, getting the king to the center and then advancing b3, c4, c5, just pushing forward. Looks tricky already, very tricky for black, and it's not a surprise that actually black lost in like 10 moves from here already. But you also shouldn't be surprised that the engine says it's a draw. But again, I'll show you why the engine says it's a draw. So king f8, king f2, king e7, king e3. Now the first, not such a great decision by black. Black should just have gone king d6, c4, g5. And again, not staying completely passive on the queen side and trying to advance the pawns on the other side of the board. Again, not so straightforward and simple, but this was a better way, and the engine says it's a draw. The problem with b5 is that after b3, white still pushes through c4, c5, and the pawn on a6 is kind of weak. And now black made the last mistake It was more of an evaluation mistake because basically here black has a choice how to defend the pawn on a6, to leave the rook on a8 or to win a tempo by going rook c8, attacking this pawn on c3, which white cannot allow to lose. So after something like king d3, to go rook c6 and defend it from the side. And it's not so easy to make this decision. Again, black made the wrong one. The correct one was just to leave the rook on a8 and go something like king d7, c4, now rook b8. Probably this was the hard move to find, because after rook a6, bc, and these pawns are attacked. Again, not so straightforward, but after c5, the rook goes back to a8, and this is supposedly a draw. All right, so I mean, I leave that to you to decide how easy this is, yeah. In the game, after rook c8, king d3, rook c6, the problem for black was that he quickly ran into some sort of a Zugzwang. So c4, f5, trying to advance, and also taking control over the e4 square, so the king cannot come there after c5. c5, g5, and now h4. Again, gh4, rook h1, and black is kind of suffering from the weaknesses on the other side. Black played g4, king e3, now the king is coming. King f6, king f4, h6, g3, and here black resigned because it's a Zugzwang. The rook cannot move. That's the problem with the rook on c6. It cannot move because the pawn on c5 is taking away these squares. And if the king moves, then the king is going forward. King e5 and d5 at some point will happen. King d5, king f5, maybe all these pawns will be lost. And white has still a protected passed pawn, so it's basically hopeless. So after g3, black resigned. So again, if you look at the game, black didn't commit any big mistake, any blunder, and yet lost without a fight. And also not a very long game, 36 moves. So this is the type of play, the type of the character of play that white is seeking in these positions from the Alapin Sicilian. And mind you, there are also quite a few good examples in the book of these positions from the Tarrasch variation of the French defense. So there are also some impressive ones there. So again, if you decide to get the book, take a look at them, because there also Tiviakov is explaining the guidelines, rules of thumb that white should follow in these positions and how to play these positions. Okay, now let's go back to move 2 and let's see the other game. So knight f3 in this game, e6, c3, knight f6, e5, knight d5, bishop c4. Okay, in the video I was recommending the move knight a3. Yeah, but again, it's not so much about the move orders, it's more about getting the position he's aiming for. So bishop c4, d6. And here it's also quite notable, Tiviakov almost never goes for these positions after d4, c4, c4, which are the, let's say, main lines of the Alapin, and they lead to completely different types of positions. But what he does is he actually always takes on d6, bishop d6, and after d4 he will exchange the d4 and c5 pawns, and he will get the position he's aiming for. So knight c6, take on c5, bishop c5, castles, castles, and here we are. Yeah, knight bd2, and mission accomplished. Yeah, it's a very practical approach to the opening, just not caring so much about the lines or critical lines or even what the engine says, but important is to kind of get the type of position you're aiming for. So bishop e7 now, black avoids possible attacks by knight b3 or knight e4, attacking that bishop on c5. And now Tiviakov has more than one game from this position, and the one we're going to look at, he played the move rook e1. But I will just show you a few moves from the other game that features in the book, but for some reason it doesn't feature in the database. I found it really strange. In that game he played knight b3, okay, and after queen c7, rook e1, rook d8, queen e2, just some standard moves, okay. The queen got away from the d file, the rook is controlling d5 square, and so on. b6 now for black, to develop the bishop to b7. And now in this position, Tiviakov played this very also typical plan, I would say, for these positions, and that's the move a4. So always keep in mind this idea. a4, the idea is to go a5 and then see what to do next. the pawn can go to a6, and this is quite favorable for white, in fact, because it takes away the b7 square from the bishop, and also secures the b5 square for a white piece. So a knight landing on b5, for example, would always target the pawn on a7, or a bishop on b5 will also be kind of controlling the light squares and would allow for the queenside majority to advance behind it. So it's curious that this position, the engine says that even black is somewhat better, but I don't think Tiviakov bothered even to pay attention to the engine's evaluation here. And one important thing that I learned from this game, for example, is that in these types of positions, and also other games that he looked at, in this type of structure, when black has played b6, you can see that these pawns are on dark squares. And this already leads us in the direction of asking ourselves which pieces should we exchange. So generally speaking, white is willing to exchange a lot of pieces in these positions and go play an endgame. We already established that in the previous game. But when it comes to exchanging light pieces, for example, one light piece that white would like to exchange are the light squared bishops. So even though you may say, okay, this bishop on c8 is a bad one, or something very limited, yeah, but once it comes to b7, is no longer a bad one. And white, conversely, would like to exchange that bishop with bishop a6 after it comes to b7, as that weakens these light squares on the queen side that white can use. So, for example, we said pawn landing on a6, knight landing on b5, and in some cases, if this pawn gets to b5 and c6 square becomes available for a knight, that is also a possibility. In fact, we will see something of this sort in the game we are looking at actually right now. So the exchange of the light squared bishops is very important in these positions for white, unlike the dark squared bishops, which white would like to keep on the board, because in the far future, in the endgame, these two pawns can be targeted by white's dark squared bishop. So these are some of just kind of rules of thumb and guidelines that Tiviakov explains when analyzing these games. So let's go back to the current game. He started with rook e1, b6, now knight b3, knight f6, knight bd4, knight white is seeking exchanges, take on d4, bishop b7, bishop f4. Okay, again, totally fine position for black. It's equal, no problems whatsoever. Yeah, but again, observe how the game progresses and how Tiviakov actually manages to win seemingly out of nowhere. Knight d5, attacking the bishop drops back to g3, bishop d6, seeking exchanges of the dark squared bishops, and you could say, aha, black is doing well here, because as we just mentioned, the dark squared bishops can potentially be, this exchange can potentially be useful for black, because without the dark squared bishop, white can no longer target these pawns on the queen side. All good so far. Queen g4. Seemingly an active move, but there's nothing to attack on the king side. Yeah, takes on g3. Another first important moment, taking with the h pawn. Now this is normally when it comes to the pawns on the h and a files, it's almost always useful to take with the pawn towards the center, because it improves the structure somewhat. In this particular case, the f4 square is taken away from the knight. And very second important point is that this pawn, if allowed, for example, if it gets to g5, it would nicely limit all these three pawns by black f7, g7, h7 on the king side. And this will make it more problematic, more difficult for black to create a fast pawn or get any dynamism of that majority, because f6 or h6 would always be captured, and then black's structure would be somewhat disconnected. But the game continues. Rook c8, attacking the bishop. Bishop draws back to b3 and rook c5. Black plays pretty well, centralizing the pieces. Neither side is activating their majority. It's not really possible so much. So how to win this? Like how to make any progress? And in this position, Tiviakov makes a very peculiar comment, is that since white cannot easily advance the majority, I mean a4 doesn't achieve much because the rook and the pawn and the queen control a5, so it won't, matter so much. c4 again is not so much of an idea because it weakens the knight on d4. So he says that basically white should look to exchange some pieces in order then to be able to advance with the majority. But how to exchange pieces? I mean, obviously taking on d5 is not that great because maybe queen can take and then there is a strong presence on the long diagonal, so it's not really convenient. So he goes for something which is, I found really amusing in a way. He says that actually, since white cannot make exchanges, white should try to make black to want exchanges. Now this sounds a bit strange, but in fact he says that how he played in the next few moves is that he tried to induce the black to think that he's playing for an attack, and then black should kind of panic and try to get defensive and seek exchanges himself. And strangely enough, this worked. So look at what happened. So rook d1, this first move, okay, it's perfectly fine, centralizing the rook. White gets away from the sensitive d file, queen c8, and now rook e5. This is the key move. So centralizing the rook, but maybe introducing some vague ideas like rook g5 or rook h5, and then queen comes to the h file, maybe bishop c2 and so on. So all of a sudden it appears that, okay, white may be creating some sort of an attack. But this is just a trick. And Tiviakov generally says that in these positions, these typical positions that we are exploring, 3 versus 2 on the queen side and 4 against 3 on the king side, white should never really play for an attack unless some lines in the French, when white castles long and then can march forward with the g pawn. And black has also played the move h6, so g5 can open up the lines on the king side. Otherwise, there is no attack. And white should play always on the queen side and going for an endgame. So you see these, you pick up these interesting tidbits of wisdom for particular positions when you study games of players who have mastered them. So in view of these ideas, what black does, knight f6. So he's defending and, even more importantly, going for exchanges. Queen e2, take on e5, queen e5, rook d8, knight b5, more exchanges, threatening knight a7, knight e6, rook d1, and bishop d1. And all of a sudden, like it was like 4 moves after we were discussing the position, black himself exchanged all heavy pieces and white achieved the desired endgame. On the other hand, still a draw. Still perfectly fine for black. But we are getting towards what white is trying to do. Tiviakov also says, from an engine perspective, easy draw. For a human perspective, already problematic, because the pawn is hanging and there are some ideas like knight d6, queen d6, when even visually white is putting pressure on black's position. So a6, getting the knight kicked away from b5, knight drops back to d4. Not probably knight d6, queen b8 would be some sort of an unpleasant pin maybe, even though maybe knight f7 works then, but maybe just simply queen c6 threatening mate, yeah. And now h6. This is the key moment perhaps in the whole game, because even though it looks like completely equal and so on, we said, but white has the visual initiative, and in fact black in this position ignored white's threat. And white's threat could be deduced from the fact that white decided to leave the d6 square vacant. So he put the knight on d4. And the threat here is to go queen d6 and start targeting the pawns on the queen side. And also the queen is quite dominant on d6, dominating the black queen on c8. So here black should have played the move queen d8, stopping queen d6. Even though the game, of course, would have continued. White would go a4, and then ideas like a5, yeah, trying to soften the black structure. Then maybe b4, c4, c5, just the automatic advance of the queen side pawns, which now, as you can see in an endgame, is perfectly possible. But after h6, which you could also say perfectly fine move, opening a luft, nothing wrong with it. But after queen d6 already there are problems on the board. The pawn is hanging. And after b4, b5, a4. And you can see all of a sudden the queen side, black's queen side is under attack and white is maximizing his majority. Now in case of b takes a4, bishop a4, white already has a passed pawn on the c file. Whereas after knight e4, attacking the queen, queen e7 is still problematic. Yeah, the queen is very, very annoying and is dominating its counterpart, the queen on c8. Now after b takes a4, bishop h5 suddenly, and the pawn on f7 cannot be defended. Yeah, if something if g6, then bishop g6 and knight e6 probably should be decisive. Or in case of knight g5, f4, attacking the knight, and f7 falls. And all of a sudden, I said white normally doesn't attack on the king side, but even in the endgame, sudden attacks like this can happen thanks to that queen being on e7. So black is basically lost. Move 30. There you go. Yeah. So the game concluded. Bishop d5, take on f7, bishop f7, king h8, bishop e6. It's just collection time. Take on e6, knight e6, threatening mate. Queen g8, knight g7, small trick, winning another pawn. The knight on e4 is hanging. Queen d5, check on f8, king h7, knight f5, check on d1, king h2, and black resigned. Okay, if queen h5, then simply knight h4, and there are just too many loose pieces and pawns in black's position. There is a threat of check on e7, the knight is hanging, and these two pawns on the queen side will likely fall. So black resigned. And again, you see kind of a very game that was equal for a very long time. Black didn't seem to have any problems for a very long time, and then suddenly he lost. But it's all in the character of the position and this I think human aspect of these positions, where you get a position that the engine says it's an easy draw or equal or zeros, but then the human loses it in a few moves because psychologically it's difficult to play those positions, exactly because of the fact that white has a clear-cut plan of queenside expansion, attacking the queenside pawns that black has, coupled with the several guidelines and rules of thumb that I mentioned along the way. So there you go. Easy play, yeah? I mean, now perhaps you're not so surprised why Tiviakov was such a strong player and happened to win a lot of open tournaments and be so successful on the European Open Circuit. Actually, not European, World Open Circuit. Always kind of playing for top prizes, because apart from being a strong player, he had this repertoire that was really very practical, giving him the types of positions that he specialized in, and he knew inside out, and he could play very quickly and confidently. Okay, so I'll conclude this video with this demonstration. If you liked it, you liked my support, make sure you subscribe to my Substack and consider becoming a paid subscriber there. I would really appreciate it. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you smash that subscribe button. I would really appreciate that too. And tell me what you think of this video in the comments. So thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you soon again. Take care.